The black car pulled up quietly outside Bake on Brick Lane, its windows tinted dark enough to hide the famous passengers inside. Catherine adjusted her navy blazer and checked her reflection in the small mirror of her handbag one last time. Beside her, William ran his fingers through his hair and straightened his white shirt sleeves, rolling them up slightly in preparation for what lay ahead. "Are you ready for this?" William asked, his eyes twinkling with the same mischievous gleam that had gotten them both into countless adventures over the years of their marriage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone street, and the familiar smell of fresh bread and garlic wafted through the slightly open car window. Catherine smiled, the kind of genuine smile that photographers had tried to capture for years, but never quite managed to replicate. "I've been looking forward to this all week," she replied, gathering her small crossbody bag. "When was the last time we did something completely normal?" The idea had come to them during a quiet evening at Adelaide Cottage. They had been discussing their upcoming engagements when William mentioned reading about the famous bagel shop that had been serving London's East End for decades. The 24-hour bakery had become legendary among locals and tourists alike, known for its traditional methods and incredible flavors that hadn't changed since the 1970s. "What if we just showed up?" Catherine had suggested, curled up in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. Not for a royal visit, not for photographs, but just to learn something new. William had paused in his reading, looking up at his wife with interest. "You mean actually make bagels? With our own hands? Why not? George and Charlotte would love to hear about it, and Louis would probably want to eat everything we made." The security detail had initially been hesitant about the informal nature of the visit. No red carpets, no receiving lines, no carefully orchestrated photo opportunities. Just two people wanting to spend a morning learning an ancient craft in one of London's most vibrant neighborhoods. After several planning meetings and security sweeps, the arrangements had been made with the shop owners, who had agreed to open their kitchen for a private lesson. As they stepped out of the car, the energy of Brick Lane immediately surrounded them. Even in the early morning hours, the street hummed with activity. Delivery trucks unloaded fresh ingredients. Shop owners swept their storefronts, and the first wave of commuters hurried past with coffee cups in hand. The smell of spices from the nearby curry houses mixed with the yeasty aroma of fresh bread, creating the distinctive scent that made this corner of London feel like nowhere else in the world. Sarah, the third-generation owner of Bake, appeared at the door with flour dusted across her apron and a warm smile that immediately put them at ease. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that showed decades of working with dough. Her family had run the shop since her grandfather immigrated to London, bringing with him recipes and techniques that had been passed down through generations. "Your Royal Highnesses," she began, then caught herself with a laugh. "Though I suppose this morning you're just William and Kate, aren't you?" Catherine reached out to shake Sarah's floury hand without hesitation. "Please, just call us by our names. We're here to learn from you." The interior of the shop was exactly what they had hoped for. Authentically worn wooden surfaces, industrial ovens that had been in use for decades, and the kind of organized chaos that only comes from years of perfecting a craft. Bags of flour were stacked in corners. Mixing bowls of various sizes hung from hooks on the walls, and the air was thick with warmth and the promise of fresh bread. William examined the large mixer in the corner, its metal arms designed to knead enormous quantities of dough. "This is quite different from our kitchen at home," he admitted with a grin. Sarah laughed, leading them toward the preparation area where ingredients had been laid out in neat rows. "I imagine it is. But the basics are the same everywhere: flour, water, yeast, and time. The magic happens when you understand how they work together." She had prepared individual portions for them to work with, along with aprons that read Bake in faded blue letters. Catherine tied hers around her waist, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as she surveyed the ingredients before them. Measuring cups filled with precise amounts of flour, small bowls of warm water, packets of yeast, and tiny portions of salt and sugar were arranged like an artist's palette. "The secret," Sarah explained, washing her hands at the large sink, is in the timing and the touch. Bagel dough is different from bread dough. It needs to be stiffer, more resilient. These bagels need to hold their shape when we boil them, which is what gives them that distinctive chewy texture. William picked up a packet of yeast, examining it closely. I have to admit, I've never worked with yeast before. How do you know if it's working? Sarah smiled, clearly in her element as a teacher. We'll start by proofing it. Mix it with warm water and a little sugar, and if it's alive, it'll start to foam and smell like bread. It's one of those small miracles you never get tired of seeing. As Catherine measured the warm water into her bowl, she felt a sense of calm she rarely experienced during official engagements. There was something deeply satisfying about working with her hands, about focusing entirely on the task at hand without thinking about protocols or schedules. The morning light streamed through the shop's windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the simple act of measuring flour feel almost meditative. You know, she said to William as they waited for their yeast to proof, this reminds me of cooking with my mother when I was young. There's something so grounding about it. William nodded, watching tiny bubbles form in his yeast mixture with fascination. I was just thinking the same thing. When's the last time we did something where the only pressure was making it taste good? Sarah watched them with approval, recognizing the signs of people genuinely engaged with the process rather than just going through the motions for appearances. That's exactly the right attitude, she said. Bread making isn't about perfection. It's about understanding the ingredients and letting them do what they naturally want to do. The morning was just beginning, and already both William and Catherine could feel themselves settling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a skill they had never actually learned. The transformation from individual ingredients to actual dough proved more challenging than either William or Catherine had anticipated. What had looked effortless when Sarah demonstrated, it quickly became an exercise in patience and determination as they worked with their own portions. Catherine's first attempt at incorporating the flour resulted in a mixture that resembled wet sand more than dough. She paused, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist to avoid getting flour in her hair. This is rather more difficult than it looks, she admitted, examining the crumbly mess in her bowl. William's mixture wasn't faring much better. He had enthusiastically dumped all the flour in at once, creating dry pockets that refused to incorporate no matter how vigorously he stirred. I think I understand why people go to culinary school now, he said, laughing at his own inexperience. Sarah moved between them like a patient teacher, offering guidance without taking over. The trick is to add the flour gradually, she explained, demonstrating with her own small portion of dough. Think of it like introducing strangers at a party. You want them to get acquainted slowly, not all at once. She showed Catherine how to create a well in the center of her flour, pouring the yeast mixture into the middle before gradually incorporating the dry ingredients from the edges. Use a fork at first, then switch to your hands when it starts to come together. Your hand will tell you things a spoon never can. As Catherine followed the instructions, she began to feel the dough change beneath her fingers. What had been separate elements slowly began to unite, forming something that felt alive and responsive. The texture changed from rough and shaggy to smooth and elastic, requiring more kneading than she had expected. It's quite a workout, she observed, using the heel of her hand to push the dough away from her before folding it back over itself. Her navy blazer was beginning to feel warm in the heated kitchen, and she could see why Sarah had suggested they might want to remove their outer layers. William had finally achieved a coherent ball of dough, though his technique was more enthusiastic than refined. I feel like I'm wrestling with it, he said, working the dough with determination. Flour had somehow migrated to his forearms, and there was a small smudge on his cheek, giving him the appearance of someone who was thoroughly engaged in the process. That's not entirely wrong, Sarah laughed. Bagel dough is meant to be worked hard. Unlike other breads that can become tough if you overwork them, bagels actually need that firm kneading to develop the right texture. You want it to be smooth and quite stiff. As they worked, Sarah shared stories about the shop's history and the neighborhood's evolution. My grandfather started with just enough money to buy flour for one day's worth of bagels, she explained, her own hands working a much larger portion of dough with practiced efficiency. He would make them at night and sell them fresh in the morning. If it didn't sell, the family didn't eat. Catherine paused in her kneading, struck by the weight of that history. And now you're teaching us the same techniques he used, the same recipes, the same methods. We've never changed the fundamental process because it works. Some things don't need improving, they just need preserving. The conversation flowed as naturally as their developing rhythm with the dough. William asked about the different types of flour, genuinely curious about how variations in protein content affected the final texture. Catherine wanted to know about the timing, how the shop managed to have fresh bagels available around the clock without compromising quality. It's all about planning, Sarah explained, checking their progress and nodding approvingly. We start new batches before the previous ones are finished. There's always dough rising, always bagels boiling, always something coming out of the oven. It's like conducting an orchestra where every instrument plays at a different tempo. As their dough reached the proper consistency, Sarah showed them how to test for readiness. Press your finger into it gently, she instructed. If it springs back slowly but doesn't completely fill in, it's ready for the first rise. William's dough passed the test on the first try, much to his surprise and delight. Catherine's needed just a bit more kneading, which she accomplished with renewed confidence. Both portions were then placed in oiled bowls and covered with damp towels to rise. Now comes the hard part, Sarah said with a mischievous smile. We wait. While their dough underwent its first rise, Sarah offered to show them around the rest of the operation. They moved through the shop like tourists in their own city, discovering corners of London life they had never experienced despite living their entire lives in England. The boiling stations were perhaps the most fascinating part of the process. Large pots of water bubbled continuously, each one carefully maintained at the precise temperature needed to give the bagels their characteristic crust. This is what makes them different from any other bread, Sarah explained. The brief boil before baking creates that shiny, chewy exterior that bagel lovers crave. Catherine watched the process with the same attention she brought to her official duties, asking detailed questions about timing and temperature. How do you know when they've boiled long enough? Experience, mostly. You learn to read the signs, how they float, how their surface looks, how they respond when you flip them. It's more art than science, despite what recipe books might tell you. William was particularly fascinated by the ovens, massive brick structures that had been in continuous use for decades. The heat radiating from them warmed the entire shop, and he could see how the work would be both rewarding and physically demanding. Do you ever get tired of the early mornings and the heat? Sarah considered the question seriously. Every job has its challenges, but there's something satisfying about creating something people genuinely need and enjoy every single day. When someone bites into a bagel we made and smiles, that makes the early mornings worthwhile. As they returned to check on their rising dough, both William and Catherine found themselves thinking about the relationship between work and satisfaction, between tradition and innovation. The dough had doubled in size, looking transformed from the dense masses they had kneaded earlier. Ready for the next step? Sarah asked, rolling up her sleeves in preparation for shaping the bagels into their distinctive ring form. This is where it gets really interesting. Shaping the bagels proved to be an entirely different skill set from mixing and kneading the dough. Sarah demonstrated the traditional method, dividing her risen dough into 8 equal portions with swift, confident cuts using a bench scraper that had clearly seen years of use. The key to uniform bagels is consistent portioning, she explained, weighing each piece on a small digital scale. Professional bakers develop an eye for it, but when you're learning, measuring helps ensure they'll all bake evenly. Catherine approached the task with her characteristic attention to detail, carefully dividing her dough and adjusting the portions until each piece was precisely the same weight. William took a more intuitive approach, eyeballing the divisions and making adjustments based on how they looked rather than what they weighed. Now for the fun part, Sarah said, picking up one of her portions. There are 2 schools of thought on shaping bagels. You can roll them into ropes and join the ends, or you can flatten them and poke a hole through the middle. I'll show you both methods." She demonstrated the rope method first, rolling a portion of dough between her palms and the work surface until it formed a smooth, even cylinder about 8 inches long. Her movements were fluid and practiced, the result of thousands of repetitions over the years. "Keep the pressure even and work from the center outward," she instructed. "You want it thick enough to hold together, but thin enough to create a proper hole when you join the ends." Catherine attempted to replicate the technique, her first effort resulting in a rope that was thicker on one end than the other. "This is rather like working with clay," she observed, rolling the dough again to even out the thickness. "It requires a completely different touch than I expected." William's approach was more vigorous, his natural inclination toward efficiency showing as he worked to shape his portion quickly. The result was functional but somewhat uneven, with bumps and thin spots along its length. "I think I'm being too aggressive with it," he admitted, starting over with a gentler touch. "Dough responds to your energy," Sarah explained, watching their progress. "If you're tense or hurried, it fights back. If you're calm and patient, it cooperates. It's almost like it can sense your mood." As they worked on their rope-shaping technique, Sarah shared more about the cultural significance of bagels in London's East End. "This neighborhood has been home to waves of immigrants for centuries," she said, her hands working automatically as she spoke. "Each group brought their own foods and traditions, but bagels have been a constant. They're portable, filling, and perfect food for people working long hours." The conversation provided a rhythm for their work. Catherine found herself relaxing into the motion of rolling, her bagel ropes becoming more consistent with each attempt. William discovered that lighter pressure actually produced better results, though his competitive nature made him want to work faster than the dough preferred. "Now to join the ends," Sarah continued, taking one of her perfectly shaped ropes. "Overlap them by about an inch, and pinch firmly to seal. You want the connection to be strong enough that it won't separate during boiling, but not so thick that it creates a lumpy area." This proved to be another skill requiring practice. Catherine's first attempt resulted in a connection that looked obvious and bulky, disrupting the smooth curve of the bagel. She gently worked the seam to make it less prominent, learning to feel when the dough was properly joined. William's seal was secure, but left a visible thick spot that he couldn't quite smooth away. "It looks more rustic than elegant," he said with a laugh, examining his handiwork. "Rustic is perfectly acceptable," Sarah assured him. "Handmade bagels are supposed to show signs of the human touch. Perfect uniformity usually means machine production." The alternative method, poking holes through flattened discs of dough, proved equally challenging in its own way. Sarah showed them how to gently flatten each portion into a disc about 4 inches across, then use their thumbs to create the center hole, gradually working it larger while maintaining the overall shape. "The hole should be about 1/3 the diameter of the bagel," she explained, demonstrating the technique with smooth, confident movements. "Too small, and it will close up during rising and baking. Too large, and you end up with a bread ring instead of a proper bagel." Catherine's attempt at the hole-poking method produced a more even result than her rope-joining technique. She had a natural sense for the proportions and worked carefully to maintain the circular shape while enlarging the center opening. William found this method more intuitive, his larger hands well-suited to the task of stretching the dough. His bagels had a pleasingly organic shape, each one slightly different, but recognizably authentic. As they worked through their portions of dough, each using the method that felt most comfortable, the shop filled with the sound of easy conversation and occasional laughter when someone's bagel turned out lopsided or the hole closed up unexpectedly. "The beauty of this craft," Sarah observed, arranging their finished bagels on parchment-lined trays, "is that even the imperfect ones taste wonderful. Shape affects appearance more than flavor." Their collection of bagels represented a clear learning curve. The first attempts were irregular and uncertain, while the later ones showed growing confidence and skill. Each bagel bore the unmistakable marks of hand shaping. Slight variations in size, individual character in the curves, small imperfections that somehow made them more appealing than machine-perfect alternatives. These need to rest for about 15 minutes before we boil them, Sarah explained, covering the trays with clean kitchen towels. The brief rest allows the gluten to relax, which helps them hold their shape during the next steps. While they waited, Sarah prepared the boiling water, adding a small amount of malt syrup to each pot. The malt gives the crust its color and contributes to the flavor, she explained. Some bakers use honey or sugar, but malt is traditional and gives the best results. Catherine and William watched the preparation with the same attention they brought to state functions, understanding that they were witnessing a process refined over generations. The anticipation of seeing their handmade bagels transformed through boiling and baking was building, along with their appreciation for the skill required to make this seemingly simple food correctly. "Ready for the next adventure?" Sarah asked, testing the water temperature with a practiced finger. This is where your bagels really become bagels. The transformation that occurred when the bagels hit the boiling water was nothing short of magical. Sarah carefully lifted the first of Catherine's bagels with a slotted spoon and gently lowered it into the bubbling pot. Within moments, the pale, soft dough began to change, the surface tightening and taking on a subtle sheen. "Watch how it floats," Sarah instructed, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who still found wonder in a process she had performed thousands of times. When fresh bagels hit the water, they should bob to the surface almost immediately. If they sink and stay down, the dough wasn't quite right. Catherine leaned in to observe, careful to stay clear of the steam rising from the pot. Her bagel floated beautifully, rotating slowly in the gentle current created by the boiling water. "How long do they stay in?" "About 30 seconds to a minute per side," Sarah replied, using a timer more for their benefit than her own. "Just long enough for the exterior to set, but not so long that they become tough. You'll see them puff slightly as the steam inside expands." William's turn came next, and he watched with fascination as a somewhat lopsided creation transformed in the hot water. The irregular shape that had concerned him actually gave his bagel character, and the brief boiling seemed to even out some of the imperfections in his shaping. "This is incredible," he said, genuine amazement in his voice. You can actually see it changing texture. Sarah flipped each bagel carefully, ensuring both sides received equal treatment. The brief boiling created a skin that would become the characteristic chewy crust during baking, while the interior remained soft and yielding. As she lifted them out and placed them on clean towels to drain, the bagels already looked more professional than their humble beginnings had suggested. "The boiling step is what separates bagels from every other type of bread," Sarah explained, working through their collection with practiced efficiency. "It's also the most unforgiving part of the process. Too long and they become tough, too short and the crust won't develop properly. There's no adjusting once they go in the oven." As the last of their bagels completed its water bath, Sarah preheated the massive brick ovens to precisely the right temperature. The heat radiating from the open doors was intense, requiring her to work quickly when loading and unloading. "Professional bagel making is definitely a summer challenge," she admitted, wiping perspiration from her forehead. "But the ovens give results you can't get from home equipment." While the ovens heated, they prepared toppings for some of the bagels. Sarah had arranged small bowls of sesame seeds, poppy seeds, coarse salt, and everything seasoning, the distinctive mixture of garlic, onion, sesame, poppy seeds, and salt that had become synonymous with New York-style bagels. "This is where you can really personalize them," she said, showing them how to brush the drained bagels lightly with beaten egg wash before sprinkling on the toppings. The egg helps the seeds stick and gives extra browning in the oven. Catherine chose sesame seeds for most of hers, carefully distributing them to ensure even coverage. She approached the task with the same methodical attention she brought to arranging flowers or setting tables for state dinners, understanding that presentation mattered even for simple food. William experimented with combinations, creating bagels with everything seasoning, some with just coarse salt, and one adventurous attempt that combined sesame and poppy seeds. "I think I'm getting carried away with the artistic possibilities," he admitted, stepping back to survey his handiwork. "That's the joy of making your own," Sarah encouraged. "You can create exactly what appeals to you rather than settling for whatever happens to be available." The loading of the ovens required teamwork and quick movements. Sarah used long wooden paddles to slide the bagels onto the brick floor of the ovens, their tops already beginning to glisten from the egg wash. The intense heat meant the oven doors could only remain open for brief periods, requiring careful choreography to get everything positioned correctly. 12 to 15 minutes, Sarah announced, setting her timer and closing the oven doors. "Now we wait and hope we got everything right." The waiting period provided time for reflection on the morning's experience. Catherine found herself thinking about the connection between this simple craft and the broader themes of tradition, community, and the satisfaction of creating something useful with one's own hands. "It's remarkable how much skill goes into something we often take for granted," she observed, watching through the oven window as their bagels began to brown. "I'll never look at a bagel the same way again." William nodded in agreement, still slightly amazed by the transformation they had witnessed. It makes you appreciate the expertise required for even seemingly simple things. Sarah makes it look effortless, but there are clearly years of learning behind every step. As the timer approached its final minutes, the aroma filling the shop became irresistible. The smell of browning crust combined with the fragrance of toasted seeds created an atmosphere that made their early morning start feel completely worthwhile. Sarah checked the ovens frequently during the final minutes, her experienced eye noting the subtle changes in color and texture that indicated doneness. "They're ready when they sound hollow if you tap the bottom," she explained, though she could judge their completion by sight alone. The moment of removal was almost ceremonial. Sarah opened the oven doors to reveal 24 golden brown bagels, their surfaces glossy and their tops adorned with perfectly toasted seeds. The transformation from the pale, soft dough they had shaped earlier was complete and dramatic. "They're beautiful," Catherine breathed, genuinely moved by the sight of their morning's work rendered into something both appealing and edible. William couldn't resist reaching for one immediately, then pulled his hand back when he remembered how hot they would be. "When can we try them?" "They need to cool for just a few minutes," Sarah said, carefully transferring them to cooling racks. "But warm bagels are one of life's great pleasures. You've definitely earned the right to taste your creations." As they waited for the bagels to cool enough to handle, both William and Catherine felt a deep sense of accomplishment that went beyond the simple completion of a cooking project. They had spent the morning learning not just a skill, but gaining insight into a way of life and work that connected them to centuries of tradition and community. The first bite was a revelation. Catherine chose one of her sesame bagels, still warm enough that steam rose from the interior when she broke it open. The contrast between the chewy, slightly crispy crust and the soft, dense interior was exactly what she had hoped for. But experiencing it in something she had made herself added an entirely new dimension to the familiar taste. "This is extraordinary," she said, savoring the complex flavors that developed as she chewed. "I can actually taste the difference between this and store-bought bagels." William had selected one of his everything bagels, and his expression of surprise and delight was unmistakable. "The flavor is so much more intense," he agreed, examining the cross-section of his creation. "And the texture is completely different, more substantial somehow." Sarah beamed with pride, not just in their success, but in their genuine appreciation for what they had accomplished. "That's the difference between real fermentation and rushed commercial production," she explained. "The slow rise develops flavors you simply can't achieve when you're trying to maximize speed and volume." As they continued sampling their morning's work, Sarah prepared a selection of traditional toppings: cream cheese, smoked salmon, capers, and thin slices of red onion. "Bagels are wonderful on their own," she said, "but they're also the perfect canvas for other flavors." The transformation of their simple bread into a complete meal felt like the natural conclusion to their morning's education. Catherine assembled a bagel with cream cheese and smoked salmon, taking care to distribute the ingredients evenly, while William opted for a simpler preparation with just cream cheese and a sprinkle of salt. You know what strikes me most about this experience? Catherine said, pausing between bites. It's the connection to something larger than ourselves. This recipe, these techniques, they've been feeding people for generations. William nodded thoughtfully, and every person who learned to make these contributed something to keeping the tradition alive. We're part of that chain now, in a small way. Sarah's eyes brightened at their words. That's exactly it, she said. When my grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me, they weren't just passing on recipes. They were sharing a way of understanding food, community, and craftsmanship. Now you can share that with your children. The conversation turned to the practical aspects of what they had learned. Sarah provided them with written copies of the recipe they had used, along with notes about timing, temperature, and the small adjustments that could improve their results at home. The hardest part will be reproducing the boiling and baking steps in a home kitchen, she admitted. You won't get exactly the same results without professional equipment, but you can come close with some creativity. Catherine was already mentally adapting the process for their family kitchen. George would love the hands-on aspect of kneading and shaping, she mused. And Charlotte would probably want to experiment with different toppings. Louis would just want to eat everything, William added with a laugh. Though he might enjoy the boiling step, it's quite dramatic. As their informal meal concluded, both William and Catherine found themselves reluctant to leave. The warmth of the shop, both literal and metaphorical, had created a cocoon of normalcy that felt precious in their otherwise highly structured lives. Sarah seemed to understand their reluctance. You're welcome back anytime, she offered. And I mean that seriously. Sometimes the best learning happens when you repeat a process several times, making small improvements each time. The offer was genuine and touching, representing exactly the kind of human connection that had made their mornings so meaningful. They had entered as students and were leaving as friends, carrying with them not just new skills, but a deeper appreciation for the craft traditions that sustain communities. As they prepared to leave, Sarah packed a selection of their bagels for them to take home. Your children should taste what their parents made, she insisted, wrapping the still warm bread in paper bags. And save one for tomorrow morning. They're almost as good the next day, especially if you toast them lightly. The transition back to their waiting car felt jarring after the intimate atmosphere of the shop. The security detail had remained discreetly present but unobtrusive throughout the morning, allowing them to focus completely on learning without the usual awareness of being watched and protected. How do you think we did? William asked Catherine as they settled into the car seats, both still carrying the lingering aroma of yeast and flour on their clothes. I think we discovered something important, she replied, cradling the bag of bagels they had made. Not just about bread making, but about the value of taking time to really learn something new. As their car pulled away from Brick Lane, both William and Catherine carried with them far more than just the skills to make bagels. They had gained insight into the dedication required to maintain quality in a world increasingly focused on speed and convenience. They had experienced the satisfaction that comes from creating something useful and beautiful with their own hands. Most importantly, they had connected with the kind of authentic human experience that their positions often made difficult to access. The morning had reminded them that beneath the layers of protocol and responsibility, they were simply two people capable of learning, growing, and finding joy in unexpected places. The fact that they could return home to their children with flour under their fingernails and stories of kneading dough felt like a small victory against the formality that usually surrounded their lives. We should do this again, Catherine said as they drove through London's awakening streets. Not necessarily bagel making, but learning something completely outside our usual world. William smiled, already imagining the conversations they would have with George, Charlotte, and Louis about their morning adventure. Absolutely. Though I suspect our next attempt at bagel making will happen in our own kitchen, with 3 very enthusiastic assistants. The thought of sharing their newfound knowledge with their children felt like the perfect completion of the circle that had begun with their decision to step outside their comfort zone and learn something entirely new. They'd spent the morning as students, and now they would have the opportunity to become teachers, passing on not just the technical skills they had acquired, but the deeper lessons about curiosity, craftsmanship, and the unexpected connections that could be found in the most ordinary activities. As London continued to wake up around them, both William and Catherine felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with duty accomplished or appearances maintained, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of having learned something new together.